So you can use this element injector or register a value with that element injector of this component by adding it here to the providers array of that component configuration object. Now, there are two important things you need to understand and keep in mind when using this approach. The first important thing is that now this tasks service is only available in the tasks component and its child components. So the app component, for example, would not be able to interact with the tasks service. If I try to add the tasks service here in the app component, and I try to inject it with the inject function, for example, like this, if I do that, you'll see the application crashes again with that null injector error because I'm requesting an instance of the tasks service from inside the app component, which doesn't have a provider for the tasks service. So that's important to understand. But it's also important to understand that with that element injector, every instance of the component where you provide that value, that service in this case, will get its own service instance. So if in the app component, I would duplicate the usage of the tasks component so that I have two instances of the tasks component, I would also have two totally isolated and separated instances of the tasks service. And you can see that if you save that and go back, you see I have the same app twice now, essentially, 2 times the tasks component. But if I add a task here in the first tasks component, it does show up here, but it's not part of the second tasks component because we're operating on 2 independent service instances. And that's also important to understand and keep in mind when relying on the element injector like this. Therefore, here I'll actually comment out this code and this import because I don't want to use the element injector here. And instead, I'll go back to the tasks service and bring back this add injectable decorator with provided in set to root. Because with that, we'll now have one instance of this service for the entire application. We can use it everywhere and will operate on the same instance. So if I now add this task here, it's part of both tasks components and any updates therefore happen on both instances. And that's the behavior I want here, though I'll actually get rid of that second tasks component here because it was only there for demo purposes. But that's the behavior I want here. And that is, as I mentioned before, pretty much the behavior you probably want in most situations. Nonetheless, it's important to understand that Angular has these different injectors, how you can register values, services with them, and what the consequences for your components and so on are. And speaking of that, I mentioned it before, but you're also not limited to just injecting services into components. You can also inject them into directives and, for example, also into other services, which is what I want to do next. Thus far in this course and also in this section, we used services to inject them into components. Now, I did mention that you can also inject them into directives, and that will essentially work just as it does with components. But you can also inject services into other services. And to show you how that works, I'll add a new service. And I'll add that service with help of the CLI because that is also something you can do. Let's say we want to add a simple logging service for demo purposes. Well, we could do that by running ngg service or nggs, then the name of the service like logging, and then in my case skip -tests to avoid the generation of this test file. That will give us a new logging service TS file, and as you see in there, we got a class with add injectable already added to it. Now here I actually don't need a constructor. Instead, here I want to add a log method to this service class here, which expects to get a message of type string. And then there I want to generate a timestamp by running new date and then to local time string, and then console log some dynamically generated string where I have my timestamp like this, and then the log message. And of course, this is just some dummy service here. It wouldn't be too useful in a real app since it only logs to the developer console. But in a real app, you could try to send log messages to a backend. Something we'll cover later, how you can talk to a backend. You could do something like this. Here, I'll just log to the console so that we can see whether that works. And now I want to use that logging service in one of my other services, in the tasks service to be precise. And if you're providing the service like this, that's super straightforward to do because it is provided to the root application injector, and therefore I can easily use it here in another service. In the task service, I can inject the logging service with help of the constructor or the inject function, just as you would do it in a component. So here I'll inject the logging service by importing that class and using it as an injection token here. And then we can use that service. For example, here in add task, I can use the logging service and call log added task with title. And then I can output task data.title here, maybe like this. And then also log here if we change the status and say change task status to new status. Like this. With that done, if you save that, if you open the developer tools in the browser and you click add task, you see the log message here. And if I change the status, you see that as well. So that works, and that is how you can inject a service into a service. Now, things would be problematic if you would not provide the logging service like this. If you would then provide it here with that app configuration object in main.ts, it would work again. So if I provide the logging service here through that providers array when running Bootstrap application, when doing that, everything would work, as you can tell. But if you would not be doing that, and you would instead try to use the element injector by, for example, going to the app component and adding providers there and then providing the logging service. If you would try to do that, then you'd get a null injector error. Because as I mentioned before, components and directives do reach out to this element injector, which is the injector to which you register the service when using this providers array here in the component decorator. But services will not reach out to the element injector because they aren't elements. They're not part of the DOM. They only have access to the environment injector or the module injector. So therefore, this approach won't work, and you instead should use this approach or provide it in the main.ts file. But if you do that, you can easily inject services into other services. This is no problem at all, and indeed something that's regularly done in Angular apps.